in the land of the mice. A curious name, but a very appropriate one, considering the circumstances. The bookstore was an old, 3-story building that had once served as a warehouse. A large sign above the door read Warehouse Sans. That was in fact the store's actual name. The old bookstore was located in the outskirts of the city of Yokohama. In fact, it was an island, an old and somewhat decrepit island. Yokohama, Japan. This city was situated near the tip of the island of Honshu, the largest of the 4 major islands that made up the Japanese archipelago. It was in the middle of the country, between the 2 large bodies of water known as the Sea of Japan and the East China Sea, and was surrounded by mountains and volcanoes on all sides. This area was also known as the Nambu Basin, a region where many large rivers originated and flowed into the Pacific Ocean. This was where the Tokaido, one of Japan's oldest roads, connected to the seas. The road stretched from Yokohama to Edo, now known as Tokyo, passing through Kyoto and Osaka en route. The Nambu Basin was the center of Japan's economy and political power. The country's major cities were located there. Yokohama, a bustling metropolis, was the most prominent example. It had grown to become one of Japan's largest ports of trade with foreign lands and had become one of the most prominent cities on the island of Honshu. It was also home to a large number of foreign residents, mostly Chinese. The port was built along a narrow strip of land along the shore. The only way to reach it from the surrounding mountains was to take a winding road down from the hills that ran beside the sea. This was also the location of the island's most famous landmark, a large red brick tower that stood alone at the end of the road. The tower looked like a lighthouse, but it was not a lighthouse. Instead, it was an observation tower. The tower stood on a hill overlooking Yokohama and was open to anyone who wanted to climb up and enjoy a view of the city from its highest floor. The hill itself was known as Black Hill, and on the hilltop stood a building, a 3-story structure built out of brick. The building had been originally constructed for the purpose of observing the harbor from the particular spot and was known as the Observation Tower. Now it served as the headquarters for a certain secret organization that dealt with international affairs, one that was extremely interested in what was going on in the world around them and did not hesitate to go against the nation's wishes and policies to do so. The organization was known as the Warehouse Sans, or Warehouse in short, and they were an independent intelligence agency that dealt with matters related to international espionage and smuggling, as well as other kinds of clandestine operations. They were one of the most powerful organizations in the country. They were also considered one of the most dangerous. They were said to be made up of former government officials, former members of the military, and even some who had worked for various law enforcement agencies. The members were all skilled and experienced in their respective fields. Their work was not without some risk, but they also had plenty of rewards. The man who had been charged with investigating this organization and its activities was an agent working for the police department who went by the code name of Kensei, or Sword. He had been ordered to infiltrate this secret organization and obtain information about them. He had been told he would receive a significant amount of money for his efforts, and it was enough to make him very eager to succeed. Kensei's assignment had begun with a single task: to observe the bookstore. He had been ordered to keep an eye on the store for a full year, and he had to make sure he obtained detailed information on its clients and visitors. He had been told that this would be more difficult than any previous operation he had attempted, but he would have to try. This time he would be allowed to make use of some equipment he had never used before. He had never done anything quite like this before, but he did not question his orders. He simply followed his instructions and began to gather information. Hey! Just as Kensei had been observing the bookstore, an older man walked over to him. He was in his early 40s, and he wore a dark suit, a black tie, and a hat. He carried a leather bag over his shoulder and wore a pair of sunglasses over his eyes. His face looked slightly rugged but clean, and his hands were smooth and soft. He was tall and thin with longish hair that reached down to his shoulders. His face was rather sharp, but he was also calm and collected. "I'm glad I found you here," he said in a calm tone that was a far cry from his appearance. "I have just received some information regarding your investigation." "Oh? Yes, I thought you might want to know." Kensei was surprised at how fast his boss had gotten back to him after he had left the office. "That's great news. What did you find out?" "I received word that this bookstore is in fact one of the warehouses for an organization known as the Warehouse Sans, and that they are using this building as their headquarters." Kensei felt a cold chill run down his spine. This was indeed some pretty bad news. He had not expected to hear anything about this organization while he was investigating it, but he should not have been too surprised that they were aware of his surveillance. The intelligence world was full of people who were skilled at deception and deceit. After all, it was probably not a rare occurrence that they knew he was watching them. But it would have been good to know sooner. Kensei thought that he would probably be able to learn something about them from the bookstore if he could just get inside it and start looking around. Now that his cover had been blown, though, it would be more difficult to get inside and snoop around. The best thing now would be to leave right away. But Kensei was too curious to leave now. There had to be something there that would give him some valuable information. It was possible they would know that he was aware of their existence. But Kensei had always prided himself on his ability to remain unseen, even in his work as a detective. "Are you sure about this?" Kensei asked his boss in a trembling voice. Of course. Kensei did not believe him for a second. He didn't know what kind of tricks his boss had up his sleeve, but if he had really been able to determine this much already, then there was no reason why he couldn't tell him exactly who ran the organization. If he wanted to know about their secret identities, he could easily have asked one of their informants who had been doing this kind of work for many years and knew how to keep themselves safe from the danger of being discovered. But Kensei knew that his boss never talked about things like that, so he had no choice but to trust his words. "Are you sure?" he repeated in a slightly louder voice. "Yes," his boss replied calmly as he stared back at him with those unreadable sunglasses. "This organization has been operating under the guise of a bookstore for several decades now, so I have no doubts that they are indeed using this building for that purpose, and the man who runs this place is the head of the group." Kensei gulped loudly when he heard his boss's last comment. "The head?" "Yes. I'm not sure if you remember him or not, but his name is Miyuki Shiba. He is the owner of this bookstore and the head of the warehouse Sands." Kensei's mind went blank for a moment as his eyes widened in surprise. "The head of the group?" That was what his boss had said, and Kensei immediately realized why. It was a simple deduction, but it was enough to explain everything. The owner of the store was in fact the man who had run the organization for as long as anyone could remember, or at least it was likely that he had. This man had been hiding in plain sight for all those years, but now he finally knew that someone was aware of what he had been doing all those years and had finally managed to expose him. Kensei could only assume that it was because of his own investigation, but he wasn't really sure about that either. It seemed more likely to him that his boss was behind this somehow, since he had always seemed to be aware of all kinds of things Kensei had no way of knowing about. This man who had been in charge of an organization for all these years must have felt his presence for some time now. He must have known all along that there was an enemy among them and had been quietly waiting for them to come after him so he could turn the tables on them once and for all. Kensei realized that he hadn't been expecting to learn that this organization he had been spying on had actually been so powerful and powerful enough to be running a secret organization that operated out of this country for so many years without anyone noticing. He hadn't even considered the possibility that such an organization existed at all in this world until he had been assigned to this job by his superior officer and learned that such an organization existed and that they had a branch in Yokohama. Now he understood what kind of man this was who had taken control of such a dangerous group of people over many years, but he had also learned that he was now trapped in their hands and was unable to escape from them. He now knew that this man who had been running the organization all these years was in fact the leader of this very dangerous group, and this meant that they now knew who he was as well. This realization left Kensei feeling uneasy about the future. He didn't know whether or not this man knew he was aware of who he was, but there was no way for him to know if they had any sort of plan or backup for such a situation. If he were going to escape this dangerous organization, he had better do it soon, before they had decided on what to do about him and had decided to put a bullet in his head.